The loneliest place in the world isn't an empty house. It's standing beside the man you love and realizing he wouldn't notice if you disappeared. Rain washed against the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of the New York estate. It blurred the city skyline into streaks of gray and bruised blue. Inside the massive marble kitchen, the temperature always felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. Serena Moretti stood near the polished island. Her posture was perfectly straight as she sorted through the morning deliveries. The quiet hum of the espresso machine was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. For 7 years, she had managed the invisible architecture of this home. Every detail rested in her hands, from the exact blend of dark roast beans to the precise folding of the morning paper. Footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor. Clara Benson, the longtime housekeeper, approached with a silver tray. It held the final stack of premium mail. "The courier just dropped these off, ma'am," Clara said quietly. She set the tray down. Serena offered a gentle nod. Her fingers sorted through the polished envelopes. Most were standard corporate correspondences and architectural proposals. But at the bottom of the stack lay a thick cream-colored envelope. It bore the unmistakable wax seal of the family matriarch. She slid her fingernail under the flap and pulled out the contents. It was an engraved silver invitation to a grand celebration. It was for Beatrice Moretti's traditional manor in Long Island. The calligraphy was elegant. It looped in deep black ink to announce the 35th birthday of the family's reigning heir. Serena ran her thumb over the heavy textured paper. She felt the sharp indentation of the letters pressing into the cardstock. Her eyes scanned the crisp text. She searched for the familiar secondary line, Anthony Moretti. The space beneath his name was completely and intentionally blank. There was no mention of his wife. There was no polite inclusion of a +1. Her existence had simply been erased from the guest list. Clara stood just a few feet away. She noticed the sudden stillness in the younger woman. The housekeeper's sharp eyes caught the empty space on the heavy card. She hesitated. Her voice dropped to a soft and careful register. "Perhaps there is a second envelope, ma'am." An oversight by the stationer. The older woman's jaw tightened. It was an unspoken defense of the wife. Serena practically ran the entire syndicate's domestic front without a fraction of the respect she deserved. But she knew better than to offer pity. Pity required a victim, and Serena carried herself with a quiet, devastating dignity. She didn't cry. Her breathing didn't hitch. She merely continued tracing the blank space where her identity should have been recognized. "It isn't an oversight, Clara," she answered. Her voice was even and smooth. "It is a statement." She didn't tear the paper. She didn't crumple the heavy card. Instead, she quietly placed the invitation back onto the tray. She aligned its edges perfectly with the other mail. "Leave it on the mahogany desk in the study," the wife instructed softly. "He will want to see it when he gets home." Evening arrived wrapped in a dense and chilling fog. The heavy oak front doors opened just past 8 o'clock. Anthony Moretti stepped into the foyer. He handed his damp overcoat to a waiting staff member. He carried the faint scent of rain, cold leather, and the exhaust of armored vehicles. It was the lingering atmosphere of a man who commanded a quiet and ruthless empire. He walked directly toward his study, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket. Serena followed a few moments later with a fresh espresso. She stepped through the doorway. The soft click of her heels announced her presence. The room was dimly lit. Shadows clung to the tall bookshelves and the edges of the heavy desk. Anthony was already sitting in his high-backed leather chair. He stared down at the delivered mail. He held the engraved silver invitation in his large hands. She set the cup down on a leather coaster. "It arrived this morning," she said. He didn't look up immediately. The silence stretched between them, thick and expectant. Anthony was a man who noticed everything. A shifted ledger, a missing security guard, or a subtle change in a rival's tone. He saw the missing name. He knew exactly what his mother Beatrice was orchestrating. Yet instead of displaying outrage on behalf of his partner, the powerful man slowly lowered the card. He avoided her gaze. He focused instead on adjusting the platinum watch on his left wrist. The metallic click of the clasp sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "My mother is hosting," he finally said. His voice was a low, controlled rumble that offered no warmth. You know how she gets around these milestones. She wants a traditional family portrait. The old guard will be there. Serena stood perfectly still. Her hands rested lightly in front of her. I am your family, Anthony. And you know she doesn't see it that way, he replied. His tone shifted into the measured, logical cadence he used to negotiate harbor shipping routes. He finally looked up, though his eyes remained guarded. They were completely detached from the emotional weight of the moment. If you come, she will make remarks. The tension will ruin the evening. I have too many associates attending to deal with the domestic scene. He picked up the espresso, taking a slow sip. Just sit this one out. It's one night. We will do a private dinner next week, just the two of us. It makes more sense. It made sense to him. He was asking her to erase herself to buy his peace. He was choosing his mother's malice over his wife's dignity. He wrapped cowardice in the language of pragmatism. Serena looked at the man who had promised to protect her. People often assume that a quiet room is a peaceful one. They don't realize that silence is simply the sound of someone giving up. Her husband was terrified of a social disruption, but he was completely blind to the quiet collapse of his own marriage. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice to demand the respect she had earned through 7 years of invisible loyalty. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. A short time later, the heavy wooden doors of the master dressing room sealed the space in an artificial quiet. Inside, the air smelled faintly of heated cotton and cedar. Serena stood at the ironing board. She moved with steady deliberation. She didn't drop the iron. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she moved toward the walk-in wardrobe. She withdrew the charcoal bespoke suit he favored for formal gatherings. The wool was heavy and impeccably tailored to project absolute authority. She draped it over the valet stand with practiced precision. Every movement she made was measured. She selected a crisp white dress shirt. She slid the warm iron across the collar until the fabric was flawlessly rigid. Love is rarely lost in one terrible moment. It slowly disappears through ordinary choices. Anthony stood near the edge of the room. He adjusted the band of his silver watch. He watched her reflection in the long mirror. He was a man accustomed to navigating treacherous negotiations. He was a leader trained to anticipate threats long before they materialized. Yet standing in his own bedroom, he found himself entirely unnerved by his wife's calm. He had expected tears. He had braced for a rigid argument about his mother's cruelty. He prepared his usual rehearsed defenses about tradition and the necessity of maintaining the fragile family peace. Instead, she offered him absolutely nothing to fight against. She moved to his velvet accessory drawer. Her fingers hovered over a row of silver and onyx cufflinks. She selected a pair of simple platinum squares. She carried them over, stopping directly in front of him. The physical distance between them was less than an inch. He could smell the faint familiar trace of vanilla in her hair. He waited for her to look up. He expected a final cutting remark that would justify his decision to go without her. She didn't. With a steady hand, she guided the silver links through the rigid buttonholes of his French cuffs. She secured them perfectly in place. Her hands didn't tremble. She reached up and smoothed the wide lapels of his dark jacket. The gesture was deeply familiar. It was an intimate ritual they had shared for years before every major event. Her palms rested against his chest for a brief second. It was an act of profound and meticulous care. To him, it felt like forgiveness. To the woman standing before him, it was the final closure of an invisible ledger. She was giving him exactly what he had asked for. A perfectly managed evening, completely free of her burden. It's just a dinner, he offered quietly. The silence was finally becoming too heavy for him to bear. You know how she is. Tomorrow we can go anywhere you want. Serena stepped back and dropped her hands to her sides. She let the empty space between them expand. She let the chill of the room settle in the gap. Have a good evening, Anthony. The words were polite, warm, and entirely empty. She turned back to the wardrobe, her posture perfectly straight. She didn't watch him leave the room. The polished marble stairs of the foyer echoed sharply under his heavy leather shoes. Anthony descended to the ground floor. He pulled the collar of his overcoat up against the sudden draft creeping through the corridor. The estate was immense. It was a towering architectural testament to his inherited power. Yet tonight, the vaulted ceilings made the space feel uncomfortably hollow. Outside, the evening mist had begun to settle over the sprawling grounds. The heavy front door swung open, held by Marco Rossi. The associate stood tall beside the idling black sedan. His dark suit blended seamlessly into the night. Marco wasn't just a driver, he was an observer. He was a quiet, hyper-vigilant fixture in the Moretti machinery. He understood the delicate emotional currents of the household far better than most. The businessman stepped out into the damp air. The gravel crunched beneath his polished shoes. He waited for the rear door to open. His mind was already shifting toward the gala. He calculated the political conversations he would need to navigate at his mother's dining table. Marco placed his gloved hand on the door handle, but didn't pull it open immediately. The man paused, glancing upward toward the illuminated windows of the second floor. "Should I wait for Mrs. Moretti?" the associate asked. The question was perfectly neutral. Anthony froze. The simple inquiry hit him like a physical blow. He tightened his grip on his overcoat. He felt a sudden defensive instinct rise in his chest. "No," he answered. His voice dropped an octave as he looked away from the house. "She is staying behind tonight." Marco's expression remained impassive, but his eyes shifted briefly back to the stone facade of the mansion. In their world, a wife absent from a patriarch's milestone celebration was never a scheduling conflict. It was a glaring public statement. Marco knew the implications. His boss knew them too. "Understood," the driver replied smoothly. He finally pulled open the heavy armored door. The younger Moretti slid into the plush leather seat, but the tension knotted in his shoulders refused to release. "It's better this way," he added. He spoke more to the darkened windows than to the man holding the door. "The party will be loud. My mother is difficult. Serena prefers a quiet evening at home." He was building a narrative. He stacked hollow justifications to block the uncomfortable truth creeping into his mind. If he convinced himself that leaving his wife behind was an act of noble protection, he didn't have to face his cowardly failure to defend her place at the table. Marco shut the door with a solid thud. The engine hummed louder as the sedan pulled away from the circular driveway. The tires hissed on the damp asphalt. The man in the back seat looked through the tinted glass. He watched the grand estate shrink in the rearview mirror. The master bedroom window glowed faintly in the mist. He adjusted his cuffs. He felt the cold platinum metal pressing against his skin. He had secured his peace for the evening. He had avoided the inevitable family war. But as the car merged onto the dark highway, the silence stretching across the leather interior felt identical to a quiet and devastating defeat. The Long Island manor blazed with light against the dark autumn sky. The driveway formed a disciplined line of black luxury vehicles. Their engines hummed in the cold evening air. Inside the grand foyer, the atmosphere was suffocatingly perfect. A string quartet played a measured classical arrangement from the sweeping balcony. The scent of roasted fig and cedarwood drifted through the vaulted archways. Waiters in white gloves moved silently across the marble floors, carrying silver trays of champagne. Anthony Moretti handed his heavy wool overcoat to a waiting attendant. He adjusted the lapel of his tailored suit. It was the exact lapel Serena had smoothed down just an hour ago. The dark fabric still carried the faint crisp scent of the iron and her quiet diligence. He pushed the thought away, stepping fully into the crowded, glittering ballroom. Beatrice Moretti held court near the towering limestone fireplace. She wore deep emerald silk and a double strand of heirloom pearls. Her posture was straight and uncompromising. The moment she spotted her son, a triumphant smile touched the corners of her mouth. She detached herself from a group of conservative family elders and glided toward him. "Anthony," Beatrice said. Her voice carried a deliberate, polished warmth. "You arrived exactly on time." She gestured to a passing waiter. She took 2 crystal flutes of vintage red wine and handed one to her son. The glass felt heavy. It caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers above. "Happy birthday, my boy," she continued. She turned slightly so the surrounding guests, uncles, distant cousins, and high society associates could hear her clearly. She swept her commanding gaze across the immaculate room. "I must say, the estate looks magnificent tonight. For the first time in years, the room finally feels elegant, truly unified. It wasn't a casual compliment to the decorators. It was a surgical public declaration of Serena's absence. The family elders standing nearby offered polite, knowing smiles. They raised their glasses in silent agreement. Anthony's grip tightened around the delicate stem of his wine glass. The deep red liquid mirrored the dark, heavy atmosphere pressing against his chest. He felt the collective eyes of his family, waiting for his reaction. A single word of defense for his wife would have shattered the carefully constructed peace of the evening. It would have meant confronting the matriarch in front of the entire mafia-adjacent hierarchy. So Anthony did what he had always done when his family's rigid traditions clashed with his wife's quiet dignity. He took a slow sip of the vintage wine and said nothing. His silence rippled through the space. It served as an absolute confirmation of Beatrice's victory. The guests returned to their low murmurs and gentle laughter. They were satisfied that the natural order of the family had been preserved. Anthony stood amidst the opulent celebration. He was surrounded by the people who shared his blood. He convinced himself that allowing this small humiliation was a necessary strategy to keep the peace. He didn't yet understand the finality of that choice. 30 miles away, the modern Moretti estate in New York stood in absolute contrast. There was no music. There was no laughter. The massive glass-walled mansion was swallowed by a profound and heavy silence. It was broken only by the rhythmic sound of autumn rain striking the panoramic windows. In the master suite, Serena moved with calm, deliberate precision. The walk-in closet was larger than the entire apartment she had lived in before marrying Anthony. It was lined with custom mahogany shelving, displaying rows of designer gowns, silk blouses, and expensive leather handbags. She ignored them all. Instead, a single modest canvas duffel bag sat open on the hardwood floor. Serena stood before the illuminated vanity mirror. She reached to the back of her neck and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace Anthony had given her for their first anniversary. She laid it gently on the cold glass surface. She removed the platinum drop earrings and the sapphire tennis bracelet, arranging them side by side. They looked less like gifts of love and more like acquired specimens from a life that had never truly fit her. She turned back to the closet and pulled out the items that actually belonged to her original identity. A faded denim jacket, 3 soft, well-worn cotton sweaters, 2 pairs of practical flat shoes, and a stack of simple linen shirts. She folded each piece meticulously. She smoothed the fabric with her fingertips before placing it into the canvas bag. There was no rush in her movements. There was no frantic energy or tearful hesitation. Anger was loud, but her current state was one of total absolute clarity. Clara Benson, the older housekeeper who had managed the estate for a decade, stood quietly in the doorway. She held a stack of freshly laundered towels. Her eyes tracked Serena's methodical packing. Clara didn't ask questions. The older woman possessed a deep, observant intuition. She had seen the uninvited birthday invitation sitting on the counter earlier that morning. "Do you need a larger suitcase, ma'am?" Clara asked softly. Her voice barely broke the stillness of the room. "No, Clara," Serena replied. She pulled the heavy brass zipper of the duffel bag closed. "This is all I came with. This is all I need to take." Serena walked over to her nightstand and picked up her leather-bound notebook. It was thick and heavy. It was filled with years of meticulously documented household schedules, Anthony's preferred routines, medical contacts, and dietary requirements for the entire family. The invisible architecture of Anthony's seamless life was contained entirely within those pages. She ran her hand over the worn cover one last time. She didn't pack it. Instead, she tucked it under her arm. She prepared to carry it downstairs to the dark mahogany study. She looked around the sprawling, immaculate bedroom. The bed was perfectly made. The soft ambient lighting cast long shadows across the Persian rug. It was a beautiful, expensive room. But as she picked up her canvas bag, she realized it had never been a home. Serena walked down the long, shadowed corridor of the estate. The marble floors absorbed the sound of her soft footsteps, leaving the immense house in absolute quiet. The packing was finished. The suitcases waited by the front entrance. Only one task remained. She turned the brass handle of the heavy oak door and stepped into the study. The room smelled faintly of cedar, cold coffee, and old leather. It was a space designed for power. It was dominated by a massive dark mahogany desk, where Anthony conducted the business he swore kept them safe. She moved toward the desk, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out and clicked on the small brass desk lamp. A sharp circular pool of yellow light spilled across the polished wood. It illuminated the intricate grain and the scattered financial reports he had reviewed that morning. She stood there for a long moment, watching dust motes drift lazily through the beam of light. She didn't reach for a pen. There would be no dramatic goodbye letter. There was no tear-stained stationery listing her grievances. Cruelty leaves bruises you can point to. Indifference leaves nothing visible at all. And words had already proven entirely useless in this marriage. She had given him a decade of quiet loyalty. And he had asked her to remain invisible so his mother could enjoy a birthday dinner without inconvenience. The answer to that request didn't require an essay. Raising her left hand, the composed woman looked at the platinum wedding band. It was a simple, elegant piece of jewelry, devoid of the flashy diamonds his family favored. She had loved its understated weight. She viewed it as a symbol of private devotion rather than public ownership. Now it felt foreign. It felt like a borrowed object that had finally expired. With a steady breath, she gripped the smooth metal. She slid it carefully over her knuckle. It resisted for a fraction of a second before slipping free. The house felt profoundly still as she lowered her hand into the pool of light on the mahogany desk. She placed the ring exactly in the center of the illumination. The quiet clink of the platinum striking the hardwood was the loudest sound in the room. The metal caught the light, gleaming with a cold, brilliant sharpness against the dark surface. Beside it lay the leather-bound notebook she used to manage the Sprawling's estate. It contained the architecture of his daily comfort. She adjusted the ring slightly with her index finger. She ensured it sat perfectly parallel to the edge of the notebook. The visual weight of the objects was absolute. She stepped back, letting the darkness of the study swallow her silhouette. The lamp remained on. The ring waited. She turned her back on the mahogany desk. She walked out of the room and closed the heavy door with a soft final click. Miles away, the celebration inside the Long Island Manor was deafening. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant fractured light over 70 guests in tailored formal wear. Waiters carrying silver trays of champagne navigated through the crowded ballroom. Their movements were synchronized and practiced. Beatrice held court near the grand fireplace. Her laughter rose above the string quartet playing in the corner. She wore a deep emerald gown. She looked every bit the triumphant matriarch of a family that valued control above all else. Anthony stood near the edge of the room. A cut crystal glass was held loosely in his right hand. He was surrounded by uncles, cousins, and business associates who clapped his shoulder and offered boisterous congratulations. The noise was constant. The warmth, however, was entirely artificial. He watched a cousin lean in to flatter an older uncle. Their smiles were broad and meaningless. He saw his mother accept compliments on the exquisite floral arrangements. Her eyes darted around the room to ensure everyone was properly observing her success. Every gesture in the room was a transaction. Every laugh was a calculated display of allegiance. For years, the powerful man had accepted this environment as the definition of loyalty. He had believed that the sheer volume of these gatherings, the expensive gifts, and the public displays of unity were proof of a strong family. Tonight, the architecture of that belief began to crack. He looked at the empty space beside him. Serena was usually standing exactly there. She never demanded the spotlight, but her calm, steady presence had always acted as a buffer against the exhausting theatrics of his relatives. She would listen to the endless boasting without judgment. She offered him a quiet smile when the evening dragged on. Without her, the room felt glaringly bright and incredibly hollow. Beatrice raised her glass, tapping a silver spoon against the rim. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter. It demanded immediate silence. The guests turned toward her, raising their own drinks in anticipation. She beamed at Anthony, a look of pure unbothered satisfaction on her face. "To my son," his mother announced. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, surrounded by the people who truly matter, surrounded by family. The guests cheered, raising their glasses higher. The husband looked at the smiling faces. He saw the shallow calculations in their eyes. He heard the empty echo of the toast. He thought of the quiet woman he had asked to stay behind, just to keep this artificial peace intact. The sudden realization hit him not with anger, but with a paralyzing, suffocating clarity. He was standing in the middle of a crowded room, and he had never been more entirely alone. As the crowd moved to drink, he simply stopped. He didn't raise his arm. He didn't smile. He looked directly at Beatrice, watching her expression falter as she noticed his immobility. Slowly and deliberately, Anthony lowered his hand. He set his untouched glass of champagne onto the edge of a nearby passing silver tray. The clink of crystal against metal was soft, yet to him it sounded like a lock turning. Without a single word, he turned his back on the toast. He didn't offer an excuse to the men beside him. He didn't nod to his mother. He simply walked toward the heavy double doors of the ballroom. The string quartet continued playing and the chatter resumed. But the sound faded as he stepped out into the cool, damp air of the night. The gravel crunched beneath his leather shoes as he signaled for Marco. He needed the quiet. He needed to go home to the woman who actually made his life real. The drive back to the estate felt agonizingly slow. The quiet hum of the engine did nothing to settle the tight, heavy pressure that had taken root behind his ribs. When the heavy iron gates of the Moretti property parted, Anthony expected to see the soft, golden glow of the conservatory windows cutting through the dark. Serena always left the perimeter lights on when he was out late. She never went to sleep until she knew he was safely inside the walls. Tonight, the sprawling, modern structure was entirely swallowed by the shadows. The tires crunched against the gravel driveway. The sound was sharp and grating in the dead of night. He stepped out of the vehicle before Marco could open the door. The night air was biting against his collar as he walked up the wide stone steps. He unlocked the towering double doors. The heavy locking mechanism disengaged with a loud metallic thud. He pushed them open, but didn't immediately step inside. Anthony hesitated at the threshold. The air in the expansive marble foyer felt physically cold and uncirculated. It was a still, stagnant chill. It was the kind of temperature that belonged to an abandoned museum, not a home. Normally, the house carried the faint, lingering warmth of brewed chamomile, or the subtle scent of cedar and white lilies she arranged on the center table. Now there was nothing. The atmosphere was completely sterile. It lacked the invisible humming energy of a life being lived. Serena. His voice broke the quiet, but the sound didn't travel the way it usually did. It bounced off the polished granite floors and the dark crystal of the unlit chandelier overhead. It returned to him in a hollow echo. He reached for the brass switch on the wall, illuminating the entryway. The sudden burst of light revealed a space that was immaculately clean, yet deeply wrong. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn perfectly tight, blocking out the moonlight. The decorative pillows on the entryway bench were aligned with mathematical precision. There was no discarded scarf. There was no novel left face down on the console table. There was no pair of soft slippers resting near the base of the stairs. A house that is merely asleep still breathes. This house had stopped breathing entirely. He loosened his silk tie. The expensive fabric suddenly felt like a wire around his throat. He walked further into the corridor. His leather shoes struck the stone floor with a sharp, rhythmic thud that seemed far too loud. Serena. He spoke her name again, this time without the questioning inflection. It was a command. It was an attempt to reassert control over an environment he couldn't yet understand. Only silence answered him. He moved through the ground floor. He checked the formal dining room, the dark kitchen, and the glass-walled conservatory. The long mahogany dining table, where they usually sat at opposite ends, was wiped down to a high polish. It reflected the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. The massive espresso machine was cold to the touch. The ceramic mug she always used for her evening tea was nowhere to be seen on the drying rack. The indoor plants cast long, eerie shadows against the pristine walls. The absolute lack of disorder was jarring. It was the calculated perfection of a space that no longer needed to accommodate human life. The coldness in the foyer hadn't been a draft. It had been the physical manifestation of her absence. The cold pressure in his chest climbed upward, settling in his throat. Anthony turned and took the grand curving staircase 2 steps at a time. His hand gripped the wrought iron railing, with enough force to turn his knuckles white. The upstairs hallway was an endless stretch of shadowed doorways and thick carpet that swallowed his footsteps. He bypassed the empty guest rooms. He glanced briefly at the closed doors before walking straight to the heavy oak door of the master suite. The brass handle felt icy against his palm. He pushed it open. The room was perfectly dark. He struck the light switch with the heel of his hand. It flooded the vast space with artificial brightness. The massive four-poster bed was made with hotel-like rigidity. The duvet was smoothed flat. The pillows were stacked symmetrically without a single crease. On her bedside table, the small brass reading lamp was turned off. The glass of water she always kept there was missing. The silver-framed photograph of them in Lake Como was completely gone. The one she always turned slightly toward her side of the mattress, so it was the first thing she saw in the morning. He crossed the thick wool rug, his breathing turning shallow and fast. He walked directly toward the master walk-in closet. It was a room unto itself, lined with custom mahogany shelving, tall mirrors, and soft recessed lighting. He pulled the heavy pocket doors apart. His side of the closet remained exactly as it had always been. There were rows of bespoke Italian suits, starched dress shirts, polished leather Oxfords, and glass cases filled with expensive watches. It was a monument to his power, his status, and his ability to provide. He turned his head to the left. Serena's side of the closet was completely bare. The long racks that used to hold her silk blouses, wool coats, and evening gowns were stripped clean. The shoe shelves were empty wooden planks. The velvet-lined accessory drawers were pushed shut. There wasn't a single thread, not a forgotten coat, not a lingering trace of her perfume in the air. She had packed with the meticulous, devastating efficiency of a woman erasing her own existence from his world. There was no hasty escape. There was no emotional tear through her belongings. Every hanger was left evenly spaced. Every drawer was closed completely flat. A rushed departure would have left a mess. A dropped scarf, a forgotten sweater, or a crooked shoebox. She had left nothing. Anthony stepped closer to the empty racks, moving like a man in a trance. He reached out his right hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He ran his hand along the bare wooden hangers, left suspended on the metal rod. They swung back and forth, clinking together in the quiet room. Clack, clack, clack. It was a metallic, hollow sound. It echoed against the bare mahogany walls. It amplified the profound emptiness of the space. Each clink felt like a physical blow to his ribs. He stood there in his perfectly tailored suit. A man who commanded territories, handled millions, and controlled men who operated in the shadows. He was entirely paralyzed by the sound of empty wooden hangers. He realized with a sudden lack of oxygen that she hadn't left because she was angry. Anger was loud. Anger threw things. Anger meant there was still something left to negotiate. She had left in absolute silence, and calm meant something had already ended. The walk from the master bedroom down to the ground floor felt like navigating the corridors of a tomb. The heavy oak doors, the sweeping marble staircase, the towering panoramic glass windows. All of it had been constructed to project dominance and absolute security. Yet as Anthony descended into the shadows, gripping the cold iron railing, he realized the fortress was utterly compromised. He had locked the iron gates to keep the outside world away. He failed to understand that the true threat to his empire was his own casual neglect festering inside the walls. He moved blindly toward his private study, the only room that felt grounded in reality. The dark mahogany paneling seemed to swallow the faint moonlight, slipping through the unclosed velvet drapes. His dress shoes made no sound on the thick Persian rug as he approached his massive executive desk. He reached for the brass pull chain of the reading lamp, his hand trembling slightly. With a soft metallic click, a concentrated pool of warm yellow light flooded the leather blotter. Resting exactly in the center of the illuminated circle was the platinum wedding band. Anthony stopped breathing. He stared at the small object. His hands rested heavily on the smooth edge of the desk. The ring was a tiny, devastating period at the end of a long, unspoken sentence. When he finally forced himself to reach out, his large, calloused fingers brushed against the metal. It was freezing. He picked it up and held it close to the bulb, turning it slowly. The facets of the small diamonds caught the light, casting scattered prisms across the dark wood. It gleamed flawlessly. She had polished it. There was not a single smudge of oil from her skin. There was no faint scratch from the daily wear of managing the estate. There was no lingering warmth from her hand. It had been restored to exactly what it was the day he bought it. An expensive, impersonal transaction, cleanly stripped of all shared history. The terrifying, bloodless neatness of the gesture paralyzed him. Had she thrown the jewelry across the room in a fit of hysterical rage, he could have understood. Had she left it tangled in the sheets of their empty bed, he could have convinced himself it was a moment of panicked flight. But this methodical, flawless presentation meant she had taken her time. She had stood over this very desk. She wiped the band clean with deliberate care and set it down exactly where he would find it. She left him with absolutely nothing to argue against, nothing to fix. Her composure was a weapon far sharper than any physical threat he had ever encountered. The silence of the mansion pressed against his eardrums. It was heavier than the arrogant noise of his mother's gala had been just an hour prior. He had thought he possessed the power to dictate the terms of their marriage. Instead, she had quietly closed the ledger and handed back the capital. It was then that his dark eyes drifted slightly to the right of the lamp's glow. Sitting perfectly aligned with the edge of the blotter was her leather-bound notebook. He recognized it instantly. For years, she had carried it through the hallways, a quiet extension of her own hands. She used it to manage the household staff, to coordinate the philanthropic charity events, and to organize the sprawling logistics of his life. He pulled the heavy book toward him for a brief, desperate second. He expected to find a letter of grievance tucked inside the front cover, a tear-stained note, or an angry ultimatum he could easily negotiate away with money. He flipped the dark leather cover open. There was no letter. There were only pages upon pages of her elegant, slanted handwriting. It detailed the precise, invisible architecture of his daily existence. He turned the thick cream pages. The crisp sound of the paper was unnervingly loud in the dead quiet of the room. He saw lists of vendor contacts, security shift rotations, and seasonal maintenance schedules for the greenhouse. Then he reached the sections dedicated entirely to him. She had mapped out his life with a level of intense observational care he had never once reciprocated. He read through his exact medication schedules. They were specifically timed to prevent his recurring migraines. He saw the specific blend of dark roast coffee he required before early board meetings. It was noted with the precise water temperature needed to avoid bitterness. He found the names and birthdays of his key associates' children meticulously recorded. This allowed him to offer casual greetings at high-stakes functions. He ran a numb thumb over a recent entry near the back. It detailed the upcoming week. It outlined a specialized dinner menu designed specifically to lower his blood pressure following a stressful financial quarter. She hadn't merely existed inside his house as a quiet spectator. She had engineered the very foundation that allowed him to project invincibility to the rest of the world. Without her unseen labor, the pristine estate was nothing more than a hollow shell waiting to collapse. He stared at the black ink on the page. The letters were neat, measured, and unhurried. She hadn't needed to leave a manifesto of her pain, because the notebook itself was the ultimate proof of what he had squandered. She had carried the entire weight of his world in silence, and he had repaid her by asking her to stay hidden in the shadows of his family's pride. The profound emptiness of the room finally sank deep into his chest, chilling his blood. The man who commanded loyal soldiers and controlled vast business empires suddenly realized he didn't even know how to turn on the kitchen lights. The silence inside the study was heavy. It pressed against the dark mahogany walls like a physical weight. Anthony sat entirely still in his leather chair. The platinum wedding band caught the sharp, singular beam of the desk lamp. Beside it rested the open leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with the meticulous, invisible architecture of the life he had just watched collapse. He didn't move to turn on the overhead lights. He simply let the shadows stretch across the room, mapping the exact dimensions of his sudden isolation. The sharp, demanding trill of his private cell phone shattered the quiet. The screen glowed bright against the dark wood, displaying his mother's name. For several long seconds, Anthony only watched it ring. The sound echoed through the empty hallways of the estate. The noise felt foreign now. It was an intrusion from a world he suddenly found repulsive. Slowly, he reached out and accepted the call. He lifted the cold glass to his ear without saying a word. "You abandoned your own celebration." Beatrice's voice clipped through the speaker. It was tight with aristocratic indignation. "Half the foundation board was in the conservatory, waiting for your toast. I had to tell the governor you fell ill. It was profoundly embarrassing. Anthony." He looked down at the platinum band. The metal was perfectly smooth. It was undisturbed by the chaos she had orchestrated. "Are you listening to me?" Beatrice pressed. Her tone sharpened when she received only silence. "I assume you went back to deal with Serena's little dramatic exit. It's exactly why I didn't put her name on the invitation. She lacks the composure for our circles. Let her pout in the dark." Anthony traced the edge of the leather-bound notebook with his thumb. The pages were filled with Serena's elegant handwriting. It detailed schedules for his mother's preferred florists, and reminders to send Beatrice her specific herbal teas every third Tuesday. Serena had maintained the very foundation his mother stood upon to look down at her. "A woman like that is easily replaceable," Beatrice continued. Her voice softened into a venomous sort of comfort. "Tomorrow we will find you someone who understands our family. Someone who—" That's enough. The two words were spoken so quietly they barely disturbed the air in the study. Yet they carried a glacial finality that instantly stopped his mother's monologue. Anthony leaned forward, resting his forearms against the desk. "You planned a gala to remind her she was nothing, and I let you do it because I thought peace with you was more valuable than her presence." He took a slow, measured breath. The realization settled into his chest like cracked ice. There is no our family anymore. You severed it, Anthony. You are being ridiculous over a girl who— He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice dropping into a dead absolute register. "Do not ever call this house again." Anthony ended the call. He placed the phone face down on the desk and pushed it away. The silence rushed back in, but it offered no comfort. He had finally drawn the boundary his wife had deserved for years. But he had drawn it in an empty room, talking to a ghost. 40 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the study opened. Marco stepped inside. He brought the faint smell of cold night rain and damp asphalt with him. The associate moved with his usual quiet efficiency. His dark overcoat dripped onto the Persian rug. He didn't ask why the mansion was entirely unlit. Nor did he comment on the fact that the powerful man he served was sitting alone in the dark, staring at a small ring under a single lamp. "You called, boss," Marco said. He kept his voice carefully neutral. Anthony didn't look up immediately. He carefully closed the leather-bound notebook. He treated the object with a sudden, desperate reverence. "Find her." Marco stepped further into the room. His eyes swept over at the empty shelves near the door where Serena usually kept her coat and keys. "Do you want me to activate the family network? I can have the security teams monitor the regional airports and the—" "No family network," Anthony interrupted. His voice was tight. "No noise. My mother is not to know, and the syndicate is not to be alerted. I want this done quietly. Check the black cars. Pull the estate gate logs. Run her credit cards. Find out what hotel she checked into." Marco nodded slowly. He pulled a secure tablet from his inner coat pocket. He tapped the screen a few times. The blue light reflected off his stoic features. As the seconds ticked by, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the panoramic windows seemed to grow louder. Marco's fingers paused on the screen. He scrolled back, frowning slightly, then looked up. "I can check the gate logs, but I don't need to run the financials," Marco said quietly. Anthony finally lifted his head. His eyes narrowed in the gloom. "Why?" "Because she didn't take anything," Marco replied. His tone was laced with a rare, undeniable respect. He turned the tablet around and slid it across the mahogany surface. "The joint accounts are completely untouched. I just checked the vault telemetry, her personal cards, the emergency cash reserves, and the trust allowances. They are all sitting untouched upstairs. She didn't use any of our drivers. She didn't book a flight under the family name." Anthony stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. A deep, suffocating panic rose in his throat. He controlled logistics across 3 seaboards. He could locate a missing shipping container in the middle of the Atlantic within an hour. But the woman who had poured his coffee just that morning had completely vanished. She didn't take a dime of your money, Marco added softly, retrieving his tablet. Which means she didn't leave a digital breadcrumb. She stepped entirely outside the system. If she doesn't want to be found through our money, she won't be. Anthony looked back at the platinum wedding band. It was the only piece of metal she had left behind. The ultimate proof that she had rejected his wealth long before she walked out the door. The empire he had built, the power he wielded, the financial security he thought substituted for his presence, all of it was completely useless. He was a king standing in a fortress of stone. He was entirely powerless to command the one person who had ever made it feel like a home. The drive took 3 hours. It wound away from the polished glass of the city into the salt-heavy air of the coast. Rain lashed against the windshield of Anthony's car. It was a freezing downpour that matched the erratic rhythm of the wipers. By the time he reached the narrow streets of Serena's childhood town, the sky had bruised into a deep, stormy violet. He parked across from a modest white clapboard house near the harbor. There were no iron gates here. There were no sprawling driveways paved with imported stone. It was just a small home with a sloping roof. It had a wooden wrap-around porch battered by years of ocean wind. Anthony turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the cabin was absolute, save for the heavy drum of rain on the roof. He sat there, gripping the leather steering wheel until his knuckles ached. His chest tightened as he stared at the weathered wood. In all their years of marriage, he had never once brought her here. He had never asked to see the porch where she used to read. He had only ever summoned her to his world. He expected her to seamlessly adapt to the cold, unforgiving architecture of the Moretti Empire. A soft yellow light spilled from the living room window. It cast a warm glow onto the wet wooden floorboards of the porch. And then he saw her. Serena stepped out onto the sheltered porch. She wore an oversized knitted sweater. It was nothing like the restrictive designer dresses his mother always expected her to wear. Her dark hair was loose, catching the damp coastal breeze. She was holding a steaming ceramic mug in both hands. She brought it to her lips as she watched the storm roll over the dark water. She looked entirely grounded, anchored to the worn planks beneath her feet. Anthony opened the car door and stepped out into the freezing downpour. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The rain immediately soaked through his dark suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. He crossed the narrow street. His expensive leather shoes stepped through deep puddles, the salt air filling his lungs. He stopped at the edge of the property, standing just a few feet away from the wooden steps. The mesh of the porch screen separated them. Looking up at her, bathed in that gentle, unpretentious light, Anthony felt the physical weight of his failure pressing down on his shoulders. For years, he had forced her to exist inside a toxic monument to his family's pride. He had expected her to be grateful for the cold marble halls and the endless social obligations. He was completely blind to the fact that her true world was this small, simple, warm, and genuine. He had trapped a woman who loved the open air inside a glass box. And then he had forgotten to look at her. She lowered her mug. The movement was slow and deliberate. She didn't startle when she saw him standing in the rain. She didn't gasp. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. He walked up the 3 wooden steps. The old wood creaked under his weight. It was a stark contrast to the echoing floors of the estate he had left behind. He stopped at the screen door. Water dripped from his chin, sliding down the lapels of his ruined suit. He was shivering. Though whether from the coastal chill or the crushing reality of the boundary between them, he couldn't tell. "Serena," he said. His voice cracked. It was a raw, broken sound that belonged to a man who had finally realized he had nothing left to lose. She didn't open the screen door immediately. She took a slow, measured breath, the steam from her tea rising between them. "Please," Anthony whispered. The rain masked the frantic tremor in his eyes. "Let me take you home. I can fix this. I know what my mother did, and I swear to you they will never disrespect you again. I will build a new house. Just come back." Serena looked at him through the thin wire mesh. The wind howled off the harbor, but her voice was perfectly steady. "You don't understand, Anthony," she said quietly. "You think the house was the problem. You think the guest list was the problem." She shook her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. The problem was that you thought my presence was a permanent guarantee. You thought you could leave me in the dark, and I would just wait for you to turn the lights back on. Anthony swallowed hard. His throat was tight. He reached into his wet coat pocket and pulled out the platinum wedding band. His hand trembled as he held it up, the small circle of metal catching the faint porch light. I brought this back, he pleaded. It belongs to you. I'm asking you to wear it again. Let me prove that I can be the husband you deserved. Serena finally pushed the screen door open. The hinges whined softly. She stepped closer to him. The warmth of the house radiated from her, mixing with the freezing rain that clung to him. She looked down at his outstretched hand. For a brief moment, Anthony's heart hammered against his ribs with a sudden flare of hope. Instead of taking the ring, Serena reached out and placed her warm, dry hand over his. Her touch was gentle. It was the exact same touch that had smoothed his lapels, the exact same touch that had quietly maintained his entire life. But the context had irrevocably changed. Slowly, she folded his fingers inward. She closed his hand around the cold platinum band. I can't take that, she said softly. Serena, please. No, she interrupted. Her voice carried a calm, unshakable authority. For years I stayed quiet because I thought my compliance was keeping the peace. But enduring neglect is not the same thing as finding peace. When I left that ring on your desk, I didn't just leave a piece of jewelry. I left the version of myself that was willing to disappear so you could shine. Anthony stared at his closed fist. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both, but she didn't flinch. I don't want you to disappear, he choked out. The admission tore through the remnants of his lifelong composure. I just want you. Then you have to learn how to know me here, she replied. She stepped back into the shelter of the porch. Without the estate, without the staff, without your family's permission, she looked out past him toward the dark, churning ocean. I have finally found my voice in the silence you allowed, Anthony. I am not going to give it up just because you finally decided to listen. She didn't close the door in his face. She didn't demand apologies or set a dramatic ultimatum. She simply offered a faint, guarded smile. She turned around and walked back inside the warm, brightly lit house. The screen door clicked shut behind her. It was a quiet, definitive boundary. Anthony stood alone in the rain for a very long time. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He simply looked down at his closed hand. He felt the hard edge of the platinum band pressing into his skin. His wealth, his name, and his mafia influence were completely useless here. If he wanted her back, he would have to start from the beginning. He would have to earn her day by day, choice by choice. He would have to stand in the cold until he proved he was finally ready to share her storm. He slipped the ring back into his pocket. He turned and began the long walk back to his car. The future didn't feel like a guaranteed victory. It felt like an open road. And for the first time in his life, the powerful Anthony Moretti was willing to walk it without demanding to know the destination.